Well, we've heard a lot today about design and about the materiality of the book. And I wanted to, as an historian, to look at an aspect of materiality of typography from the 16th century and suggest that too often we historians are focused on the verbal at the expense of the actual physical of the material and of the visual. And the book I want to look at is one of the few books published in Dublin in the 16th century. It's a fairly unremarkable, and it's been described as a rather anemic publication recently. It's Catechism from 1571. And I'd like to suggest that it's far from anemic, and it's actually quite an important book in cultural and in ideological terms. But before I look at the book, before I look at this catechism published in 1571, I just want to say a few words about printing in Dublin. Printing arrived late in Ireland for a variety of reasons, not least because of a lack of capital and the dispersed nature of society in Ireland in the 16th century. Print's debut in Ireland, like elsewhere, particularly in the Nordic countries, was driven by the Reformation. And for the first, I suppose, 50 or 60 years of print in Ireland, it was very much centred on questions of religious controversy. Now, I was going to start with the Book of Common Prayer, 1551, which is a fairly obscure publication, but I was rather delighted to notice in the Irish Times on Saturday, I don't know if you've seen it, there's a picture, there's a little essay on the Book of Common Prayer by Fintan O'Toole. He has it in his list of, I think, 100 objects that shaped Irish history or something. But anyway, there's a copy there's a picture of it in last Saturday's Irish Times. Printing in the 16th century was driven by the state, driven by Elizabeth, and it centred on the task of making scriptures available to the Irish in their own language, in Irish. Various attempts were made unsuccessfully down to the 1570s to enable printing to happen through the medium of Irish. Now, the trick, I suppose, with Irish was that it had a particular character, a particular font, which I'd like to return to, which I think is extremely important when we look at issues of cultural politics and more precisely of typography in early modern Ireland. But suffice it to say that the first publication in Irish in a Gaelic font in Dublin was in 1571, and it was the product of the labours of a guy called Sean O'Carnan. And I want to look at him in a little bit more detail because I think this very specific case study, which may seem quite almost antiquarian in its level of detail, actually tells us a lot about a cultural issue that continued, I think, to be relevant right down to the beginning of the 18th century. The first book in Irish wasn't actually printed in Ireland at all. It was printed in Edinburgh in 1567, and it, I suppose, derives from the fact that Irish, or a form of Irish, was spoken in Ireland clearly, but also on the western coast of Scotland, as it still is to this day. So the first book was in a classical form of Irish, which would have been a lingua franca used by the elite. The key thing to notice here is that it's actually in Roman font. The book is published in Roman font, but it's clearly also intended for circulation in Ireland. There's a bardic poem at the beginning of the work, and that poem is addressed and is urged to circulate within Ireland and to avoid England. But the key issue here is that in 1567 in Scotland a book in Irish is published using the Roman font. The first book in Ireland in Irish is published, as I've mentioned, in Dublin in 1571. It's quite modest work. It's a primer of the established the Reformed Church. Contains a catechism and various other prayers, etc. in Irish. And it says on the title cover, and I think that the thing to notice here immediately is that the Gaelic font is used. So immediately somebody, and this is, I think, an interesting part of this story, somebody, and I'll come back to the somebody, has taken a decision to publish a book in Dublin on at the behest of the established church, at the behest of the Tudor state, in Irish, using a quintessentially, characteristically Gaelic font. And it says on the title page, the Bullock Soil Globe Gaeilge, this was printed in Irish font in Dublin at the cost of John Usher, Alderman, Bridgefoot Street in June. I'm never quite clear why they use June there when there's a perfectly good word in Irish for June, but that's something probably worth looking at. It was preceded by a very rare item, a standalone ballad, which was a copy of a bardic poem dating from the 15th century by Franciscan. Again, a rather unusual choice, one would have said, for the Reformed Church in terms of its debut. One copy exists today, and it exists, I think, through happenstance. It was preserved in the library of Archbishop Parker, a Tudor Archbishop of Canterbury. And Parker was obsessed with the delineation of an ancient lineage for the Reformed Church of England. And he focused quite a large part of his research on Anglo-Saxon England. Now, somebody has written, and it's been suggested that it's his son, has written on, and I don't have a copy here, unfortunately, on the ballad, this Irish ballad, printed in Ireland, who belike used the old Saxon character. And I think this comment is the first, is the opening comment in a very curious cultural debate which continues to be discussed or to be debated right down to the beginning of the 18th century. I think the broadside owes its existence to the fact that Parker clearly saw in the Gaelic font a form of Gaelic font, and I think clearly came to the conclusion that the Saxons owed their particular character to the Irish. He had an interest in the Anglo-Saxon font because he had one of the leading Elizabethan printers of the time, John Day, cast an Anglo-Saxon font in 1566. So we have this kind of curious. We have what appears to be a very straightforward catechism in Irish, published in Dublin, but I would argue that it actually opens up a much deeper and an actually quite a rebarbative ideological use of typography with unintended consequences. We don't know who printed the catechism. John Carney was a Cambridge graduate, a cleric. I don't think he had the necessary technical capacity to actually design and cast a Gaelic font. I mean, this is, as we've gathered from this morning's discussion, typography is in large measure a specialised technology. It was traditionally thought by Victorian scholars that the Gaelic font was basically an adaptation of the existing Anglo-Saxon font. Dermot McGuinne, I'm delighted that he's here with us today, in his work Irish Type Design in 1992, made the case that there were two known printers in Dublin, only two known printers. A guy called Humphrey Powell, who's responsible for the Book of Common Prayer, and a Gaelic Irishman called William Carney, who curiously was related to the Carney from Cambridge, who published the work in 1571. Now, Carney is the first known Irish printer, the first printer that I've come across working in Ireland. He was said to have mastered the art of printing over the previous 14 years on the continent and in London. Clearly, he was a Protestant, so I assume that he mastered the art of printing in the Low Countries at that time. We can follow his activity, but the timing is slightly odd because he's clearly active in the later 16th century, and it's not clear would he have been well established, or was he of sufficient age to actually assist with the design and the casting and the printing of the work in 1571. So there's a little bit of a mystery there. Quite specialised technology unfolds, put together in the context of this publication. So who designs the font, who casts it? I mean, presumably it could well have been cast in London. The available technology just simply wouldn't have been in Dublin in the 1560s. Now, it's curious work because it's also, even though it's a state publication, if you will, it's a publication of the state church, it's closely associated with Elizabeth's authority, it's very much an official publication. I would suggest that our Gaelic Irishman from Cambridge, O'Carney, is actually slyly using the work to propagate or to advance a form of kind of a Gaelic patriotism. And he says in a little section on the Gaelic alphabet that he's done this so that he could put the Irish language in its own particular format, like every other language in Christendom. So immediately we're alerted to the fact that typography here is not simply a means of putting print on page using the appropriate font, but he's actually using this as an exercise in cultural, what I would suggest is cultural politics, cultural patriotism, nationalism, if you want to go that far, perhaps not. Brady O'Keefe, who's edited the work, has I think, concluded that fairly definitively that the font used is a hybrid mix of Gaelic and Roman characters, but it's clearly derived from Irish scribal practice. So rather like the point made by Jason this morning, there's a kind of a complementarity between print and manuscript. Clearly in the first 100 years of print in this instance, but I think, Jason, you were suggesting 50 years. So this is a work rooted, the font is rooted in the Irish tradition. It's very much a statement of Irish cultural patriotism. But it takes on a life, this association between the Anglo-Saxon font and the Gaelic font takes on a life of its own. And a very famous English historian, William Camden, in his work Britannia, published in 1586, comes up with this. And from hence it may seem our forefathers, the ancient English, learned the manner of framing their letters and of writing, considering they used the self-same character which the Irish commonly used at this day. So I'm not terribly clear how this becomes a commonplace, but it does over the next 100 years. The earliest point to which I can trace this is the connection with Parker. So this exercise in cultural patriotism, this use of the Irish, of the Gaelic font, immediately is taken up in England as the source and the sort of the fundamental format for the Anglo-Saxon font. And I think this is quite important because at this point we have, I suppose, an extraordinarily negative encounter between English and Gaelic Irish cultures, and the fact that the Gaelic Irish can make the case that something as fundamental as the Anglo-Saxon font derives from an Irish exemplar is actually extraordinarily important in terms of their own sense of self-perception, their own sense of self-esteem. Spencer picks up on it. He has Irenaeus remarked to Eudoxus, the Saxons of England are said to have their letters and learning and learned men from the Irish, and that also appeared by the likeness of the character, for the Saxons' character is the same with the Irish. Again, an extraordinary statement in the context of a work which I think is generally agreed to have argued for the wholesale ethnic cleansing of the Gaelic Irish. So in an extraordinarily negative work, he's actually paying tribute to this putative influence. And it's picked up by the Gaelic Irish in turn. And the translator of the Common Prayer makes the point in a preface to the Lord Deputy in 1608, Sir Arthur Chichester, makes the usual claim about the island of saints and scholars and so on, the usual stuff that is with us to this day. But he makes the point, the neighbour Saxons, learning them their very characters from us. So I would argue that the Gaelic Irish have picked up on this trope and they're now actually turning it back on the English side in a very, I think, self-conscious act of cultural patriotism. I could give numerous examples, but just to maybe trace this down through the 17th century, the translator of the Annals of Clonmacnoise again has it. He has the English and the Welsh coming to Ireland and being beholden to the Irish for superior education and so on. But he makes the point, the English, and he includes the Welsh in terms of the borrowing. The English Saxons is by conferring the old Saxon characters to the Irish, which the Irish never change. You can find little or no difference at all. So this kind of curious episode of cultural borrowing seems to be taking on a life of its own, to the advantage of the Irish in this case, at a period where overall the cultural encounter between English and Gaelic Irish, I would suggest, is becoming increasingly bleak. It's reabsorbed, or it's absorbed back into Irish tradition. The most famous and the most influential history of Gaelic Ireland, dating from the 1630s, unpublished, circulated in manuscript, is translated towards the end of the 17th century to English, immediately picks up on this, and Keating claims to Spencer. So Spencer, again, rather curiously and rather ironically, who makes the case for this form of ethnic cleansing, it's picked up here that, again, the Saxons had no knowledge of literature, so it's become slightly magnified still. Saxons effectively were illiterate prior to acquiring literacy from the Irish. There's an immediate translation in 1635 of Keating's work to English, and again the point is made there that our friends on the other island are beholden to us. I could bore you with repetitions of this. It continues in the tradition down to the end of the 17th century, but there is a slight twist, it seems to me, towards the end of the 17th century. A virulently pro-Protestant anti-Gaelic Irish commentator such as Richard Cox scotches the notion Irish is not a pure language, and the Irish uses Saxon characters to this day, so he's turned it slightly on its head, and he's got the Irish actually stealing the font from the Anglo-Saxons. At the beginning of the 18th century, Celtic studies, Celtic philologies, is put on a much more professional basis by the work of an Oxford scholar called Edward Clwyd, and I think his lack of reference to this particular episode, or this particular example of putative example of cultural borrowing, begins to wind down the debate. It's scotched later on by a guy called David Malcolm, who builds on Clwyd's work. Kind of standard bibliographical reference work for the 17th century, early 18th century, William Nicholson. Again, it simply says that the Irish had their own self-contained character. So this borrowing has begun to run out of steam. I would suggest that to wrap up, therefore, that what appears to be an anemic, as somebody called it recently, publication from the 16th century, from 1571, is actually curiously powerful in terms of its resonances, because it actually kickstarts this example of cultural patriotism. It also sets the standard for the use of a Gaelic font in Irish printing, and books in Irish were printed in this Gaelic font right down to the 1960s, when it was abolished by our friends in the Department of Education, on the basis that printing in Irish had become too costly and too awkward through the use of this particular font. It's picked up immediately, and it's curious that something as Irish as this font is established as the template, as the normal way of printing in Irish by the Protestant Church. It's picked up when the Franciscans really established a cottage industry in terms of printing in Irish on the continent in Louvain in the first decades of the 17th century. Most notably, a bardic poet who had become a Franciscan called O'Hosa, he modelled the Louvain font on his own particular scribal hand. So it becomes established as the normative way of printing in Irish. And these are the first two publications from the Franciscans. Even the week that's in it, I couldn't resist not bringing St. Patrick into the story. But just to say that, again, the use of the visual is something that we historians, it seems to me, haven't really grappled with, particularly in terms of printing in Ireland, printing in Irish. But an image such as this image of St. Patrick, who's probably a Flemish saint, I imagine, the woodcut, but he has got he is trampling the snakes underfoot. He's beardless, which has been pointed out to me as a rather unusual way of depicting Patrick. There's an extraordinary potency, there's an extraordinary intellectual and ideological significance in terms of the use of Patrick, in terms of the use of a Gaelic typography. So I would leave my sort of parting comments with you is to suggest that we historians, book historians, need to look at typography from a visual viewpoint, from a broader cultural viewpoint, indeed from an ideological viewpoint. And I would suggest that careful exploration of some of these issues, which are taken for granted, somebody printed a book in Dublin in the 16th century and used a Gaelic font, is actually to underestimate the strength and the power of agency and the power of choice that would have gone into making that particular decision. Thank you.